The stories. Dispatcher, who kept the secret from a bridge call, the call began with the sound that never leaves him, a river hush that sat under a thin voice. On the log, it read as a welfare check near the west span. The timestamp matched the shift change. The tower camera sent a smeared view of headlights, and the wind pushed rain and slanted ropes across steel. He wrote the first line in block letters. Male caller. Alone? No traffic lane blocked. Unknown age, unknown intent. In training, they, from the start, had said the first 10 seconds decide the rest. He believed that for years. He had a plain goal that night. Finish paperwork early, drink the cold coffee anyway, and get home before midnight. Kellen Duarte, age 38, worked as an emergency dispatcher in a river town that never liked headlines. He lived quiet. 2 rooms over a grocery where the owner knew his name and saved him bruised peaches. He was good at the slow voice and the clear questions. He kept a notebook with dates and little arrows. On the tape, his opening line sounded the same as always. County Communications, tell me what is happening. The caller coughed, then said he was at the railing near the center truss. He asked for no sirens. Kellen clicked a marker on the map and moved the cursor a hair so the unit tags would not overlap. He asked for a name, and the caller hesitated like he was picking one from a shelf he had not visited. Call me Ross, the man said, then added something about the water looking like foil if you did not blink. There was a push of air like a mic against a jacket, and the traffic under the bridge hummed steady. Kellen kept the tone even, told Ross that people could meet him where he stood, and asked what brought him there. Someone I loved died on this bridge, Ross said. And his voice steadied, like he had waited to finally say it. In his log, Kellen wrote the words that mattered. Loss stated. Prior connection to scene. No weapons reported. Calm speech. From the other console, Nira scrolled road closures and passed him a sticky note that read, Northbound lane is clear. He muted the room feed for a second, so the printer squeal would not land in Ross's ear and spook him. He asked the year of the loss, and Ross said it fast, like it tasted bad. 2014. Kellen repeated the year and let the silence work while he dispatched a patrol car and a medic unit in the background. He knew the story people told about that year. A sedan climbed the curb during a storm and hit a contractor. The papers had run one photo of cones and a dropped hard hat. No names followed, just an archived blurb and rain. From the tower camera, a freight train horn carried along the riverbank, then faded as the unit names flashed en route. Kellen asked if Ross knew the person who died by name. Ross said he knew the face and the last words. A small thing changed in Kellen then. A sound from the record shelf in his mind fell flat and stayed there. He once took a midnight call from a work crew foreman near the same span. He kept that tape in memory. Ross said the last words were not for him. They were for a dispatcher who told the crew to hold 10 minutes. Kellen tapped the headset cushion, careful to keep the room quiet, and asked where Ross had heard those words. Ross said he had heard them from a phone found in a cracked case under the North Pier after the storm. He said the phone worked for one day after the rain stopped, and that he had played the last message recorded. He said the message was from County Communications with a different voice, and it told the crew to stay clear. Kellen felt the old shift wash through him. The storm year had ended in a tangle of rumors and a closed memo. He had read that memo while filing tired overtime sheets. He filed it without speaking and chose to keep moving. On the camera, one pair of headlights slowed near the shoulder as if a driver could sense the weight of the rail. Kellen radioed the nearest cruiser to stage 2 blocks off with lights off, and he asked Nira to notify the medic quietly. He asked Ross to tell him who the contractor was, and Ross said the name with a short stop between first and last. The name matched the contractor mentioned in the closed memo, except the memo had spelled the name without an accent mark. Kellen wrote the name as Ross said it, exact and careful, then underlined it once for the transcription that would follow. He asked Ross why he came now and not earlier, and Ross said an anniversary sits on the mind like a stone. He also said that the memo never named the dispatcher who told the crew to hold, which was why he had called. Kellen understood the shape of that ask, even if the words around it were soft. He was not supposed to name staff. The policy existed for safety and sanity, and it covered nights when grief needs a door and someone tries that door. He told Ross he could share what the record allows, and he asked if hearing the process might help him stand. Ross said hearing the process might help, though he refused the idea of sirens again and asked for plain truth instead. Kellen kept his sentence length slow and warm. He said that storm calls can trigger staggered staging for worker safety. He said if there were downed lines or compromised joints, a hold might be given while a state engineer was patched in. He also said that every such hold carried timestamps, and that those stamps were kept by policy for 7 years. Ross breathed in and asked what happens when 7 years have passed, and Kellen answered before he could think of softness. He said the system cycles recordings to deep archives after 7 years, and some are erased when retention windows expire. Ross said he had a copy in case the archive could not confirm. Then he claimed the voice on the tape named a company. He said the tape used a phrase that a dispatcher would not use unless someone off-channel asked for a careful delay. Kellen had heard that phrase once. It was the night a junior engineer requested a slow approach while a supervisor closed a lane. The phrase was not suspicious by itself, and yet, in memory, it wore the shape of a request he never liked. He asked Ross to read the phrase, and Ross said it. Hold 10 for a clear handoff if site control is missing. Neera glanced over with a look that said, "Do not get pulled into the river." Kellen nodded and kept the pace steady. He told Ross he could not speak to motives of old voices, and he could not name a colleague or contractor from memory. He said he could meet Ross with a sergeant who knew the policy, and they could file a supplemental report for records. Ross said he was tired of reports. Then he asked a new question. Was someone paid to push that hold in the storm? Kellen chose his words like glass marbles placed in a line. He said he had not seen evidence that proved a bribe. He said he had seen maintenance slips that missed dates in years with bad weather, and he had seen budgets cut twice. He said contracts sometimes shifted mid-season, and miscommunication could look like intent when viewed through grief and time. The cruiser staged in the dark lot of a bait shop, and the medic idled near a closed diner with frosted windows. The tower camera picked up 2 figures near the midspan, and the wind made their jackets move like wet flags. Kellen asked Ross if someone stood with him, and Ross said a cyclist had stopped and was holding a flashing light. He asked the cyclist for the phone, and the cyclist, shouting through wind, said he would hold the light where Ross stood. Kellen brought the cruiser onto the bridge, slow and quiet, then asked Ross to look over his right shoulder for headlights. He said he would keep talking while the car approached, and he would ask simple things about the person lost. Ross began to tell a short life. He said she had a laugh that came in bursts, and she liked folded maps. He said she had taken a night shift to help a younger sister, and she kept a lanyard with a faded tag. He said he watched her set cones before the storm hit, and he watched the curve where the sedan took the line. He said no one saw the driver afterward, and the report guessed water pushed evidence downriver where it turned to silt. He said the tape he found made his chest hurt because someone with a badge kept people where the wind was worst. Kellen said he heard the pain and he believed the sincerity. Then he asked Ross to step back from the rail 1 foot. He said small choices add minutes, and minutes stack into plans, and plans turn into days that someone can live through. The cruiser moved a foot at a time. The officer called in with a whisper to confirm eyes on the subjects. The wind kicked a tab of paper along the sidewalk, and the camera caught it hopping like a small animal in rain. Kellen asked Ross about the cracked case at the pier, and Ross said the fisherman who found it gave him the phone. He said he cleaned the mud with rice and heat, and the screen woke like a held breath and showed the saved audio. Kellen pictured a kitchen table with towels and a humming space heater and the stubborn work of saving a last voice. He told Ross that someone who would do that kind of work could also stand away from the edge and breathe tonight. Ross said people kept calling him crazy when he brought the phone around, and one clerk said to forget old storms. He said he would go if someone could promise the message would not vanish into a hole where things get lost. Kellen had a rule: never promise anything that depends on someone else. He made a different promise instead and wrote it down. He said he would take a copy himself, and he would log it as a citizen recording attached to a supplemental report. He said he would list the time and origin as provided, and he would initial the line and add a contact number. Ross went quiet, and the wind filled the line again, and the cruiser stopped a car length away with no flashers. The officer on the bridge said he saw a second person keeping distance, and the cyclist raised the light toward the railing. Kellen asked Ross if hearing a small true thing might help him come off the rail. Ross told him to say it plain. Kellen told him there was an internal review back then, and it did not find a bribe, but it did find a silence. He said a manager failed to file a conflict disclosure, and a vendor had a nephew on a crew scheduled for that week. He said the manager resigned before the report made the rounds, and the findings lived behind a line marked personnel matter. He said he had read that line with tired eyes and wished it said more, and that was the part he kept. He did not say the other part out loud, which was the line about a recommended reprimand for delayed notifications. He did not say the name of the dispatcher who missed a handoff while moving units during the storm shift. He did not say that the reprimand belonged to him for a calendar mistake that lost 2 minutes when the server lagged. He believed the 2 minutes had not caused the death, yet he carried them like a coin that burned his pocket. Ross stood very still. He asked why no one told the public that someone had been asked to resign quietly. Kellen said the county tells what it must by law, and the rest gathers dust and waits for someone to ask again. He said he understood that wait, then asked Ross to walk toward the cruiser while the cyclist kept the light behind. Ross said he wanted to hand the phone over himself and watch it enter the chain that could not be erased. Kellen told the officer to receive the device and document the handoff on camera. Then he told the medic to stage closer. He kept talking to Ross about the quiet details of grief as the officer moved with hands open and calm shoulders. Ross stepped away from the rail, and the wind made the tension a little louder. Then the cruiser door clicked open. The officer took the phone and read the time on the screen for the camera, then thanked Ross and nodded at the cyclist. The medic stepped out with a blanket and stood near, and the cyclist said he would bike Ross home if that helped. Kellen set the line to a low hold and told Nira to mark the recording flagged for retention review and supervisory copy. He also wrote a note for himself to call records in the morning and ask for a manual pull from the deep archive. He would say the citizen copy exists and should be paired with any surviving log from the storm year for clarity. He would not say the rest, which was that he had been the one to misread the calendar view during a switch. He shifted to the closing questions that help people move. Any harm today? Any plan tonight? Any safe place to stay? Ross said he would stay with a friend who owed him a favor, and he would bring coffee to the cyclist as thanks. He said he would wait to hear if the recording matched the archive, and he would not visit the bridge again at night. Kellen said someone would call him within 3 business days, which felt safe to offer, and he wrote his own number anyway. He signed the log with a quick line and filed the incident under welfare resolved with evidence collected and no injury. The bridge camera caught the cruiser pulling away slow while the medic followed, and the cyclist lights faded toward the trail. Nira slid over a cup with fresh coffee and asked if he was okay, and he said yes, since people had stepped off safe. He picked up his notebook and drew a small square around the words he had written, which read, "Keep the silence clean." He drove home as rain dripped from the awning of the grocery, and the owner waved from a dark window with a thin smile. He unlocked the door and set his notebook on the table. Then he took the spare tape recorder from a drawer beside the sink. He spoke the date and the incident number and a short summary. Then he said 7 words that were just for the tape. He said the bridge call reminded him why small errors multiply and why a person can choose to carry them alone. In the morning, he brought the tape to the records clerk as a personal note to accompany the citizen copy for context. He did not include the part about his own reprimand, which lived on paper in a file that no one requested. He told the clerk that the caller needed confidence, that the system held memory, and the clerk said that part was done. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived to confirm the match, and the archived call contained the same phrase and timing. The letter said the review board would annotate the old memo to reflect the vendor relationship that had been missed. It also said the findings still pointed to weather and a panicked driver as primary causes rather than any delayed instruction. Kellen stood at the window and read the lines twice, then folded the letter and slid it under the notebook cover. He walked the long way to work and past the river that pretended to be quiet, while tugs moved lumber under the span. He thought about the part he had kept and judged whether it belonged in daylight or whether it still lived best in private. He decided to hold it until it served someone to hear it, which was not the same as hiding and felt closer to care. The stories. The quiet truth inside that coastal hospital wing. The hospital sat 2 blocks from the water, and the wing that faced the inlet stayed quiet through every busy shift. People joked about the sea air, then lowered their voices near that corridor like sound itself preferred to drift away there. On a mild spring morning, Leora Penn showed up with her coffee and a checklist, planning to finish safety checks before lunch. She was 34, and she worked as the environmental services supervisor, which meant she tracked odors, stains, leaks, and things nobody wanted to notice. She liked simple goals, like swapping cracked casters on linen bins before anyone tripped while rushing a patient. The storm last week flooded a basement stairwell, and today she wanted to log the final moisture readings and close the work order. Everything else could wait until the afternoon. Her plans changed before the first break. A nurse from the cardiac floor stopped her by the supply elevator and asked a question that landed with a small cold wait. "Did you move a bed out of 12 East overnight?" the nurse asked, because that room looked freshly mopped and nobody had the call light plugged in. Leora said no, then walked the nurse back to 12 East. The room held a made bed, smooth as a catalog photo, the kind of smooth that usually meant empty or staged. The call light cord curled like a quiet reminder, and the plug lay against clean tile. The monitor cart blinked in standby, which was normal if a discharge happened, which the board said had not. She pulled her phone and checked the overnight service log. The log showed a water alarm cleared at 3:12, plus a linen delivery at 3:28, and the standard generator test at 3:30. Nothing about a bed move. The floor techs had signed off at 4, which tracked with the rotation. She felt the wing hush in her ears as they stepped into the hall. The hush was not spooky, just oddly firm, like the sound of a theater after the speakers cut. She remembered 2 other techs mentioning the same hush months ago, which she had written down as acoustic weirdness from the renovation. The walls from the pre-1980 edition met the newer drywall at shallow angles, which could bend sound enough to make a whisper vanish. The nurse pointed down the corridor toward rooms 14 through 20, which were half full after the storm transfers. "You ever notice the alarms sound softer here?" she said, "even with doors open?" That question turned a small worry into a task. Leora thanked her, then called Rafi Soto from facilities, who was 41 and worked nights on chillers and pressure monitors. Rafi said he could meet her after he ran a test on the pharmacy air handlers. She told him 12 East first, and to bring his handheld sound meter. While she waited, she checked the housekeeping closet and found a single wet mop hung wrong side up, which bothered her more than it should. The rag bucket held 5 clean tags, which meant 1 tag missing. She counted cart liners, then photographed the tag numbers, then texted her team group, which answered with the usual thumbs and jokes. Rafi walked in with his meter and a grin, then lost the grin when he heard the haul. He held up the meter while a monitor alarm chirped in room 16. The reading was lower than upstairs by real points, not just a little. He tried the code blue test switch on the mock panel, and the hallway speaker tone sounded like a phone in another apartment. They stood there for a quiet minute that stretched. She felt the cool push of air on her ankles, like a vent trying too hard. Rafi crouched and checked the gap under door 18, then looked at a ceiling return. "This wing was set for negative pressure during a flu surge," he said, "and someone forgot to return the dampers. That could pull sound into the duct runs." They both knew sound should not disappear completely, and hospital speakers had their own lines, but the observation mattered. Leora asked if maintenance logs showed damper positions. Rafi said the old building used manual marks with paint dashes after a storm, and sometimes those faded. He called his lead, who checked archived notes from winter. The notes reportedly listed a temporary negative pressure setting for isolation overflow and a reminder to reset after discharge. The reminder had no follow-up check line, which could be simple human miss and not a cover for anything worse. Still, the room felt staged wrong. Leora walked back to 12 East, then took photos of the made bed from 3 angles, partly habit, partly evidence. She opened the closet and found a folded patient gown without a size sticker, which was nothing by itself. She checked the Sharps container seal, then stepped into the bathroom and looked at the floor drain for silt patterns. The ring looked clean in a way that suggested a recent rinse, not a final deep clean. She called central coverage and asked if a float nurse had swapped rooms overnight. The charge nurse checked dispatch logs for bed control and found a 1-minute call at 3:29 that dropped before anyone spoke, which felt like a butt dial or a cold finger hitting end. The caller ID showed the station handset in this wing. Leora went to the security office and asked for hallway footage. The officer on duty, a patient man named Colm Reyes, 37, pulled the clip from 3:15 to 4. They watched the split screens without commentary. At 3:17, a linen cart rolled in from the elevator without a staff badge visible. The cart moved slowly, with one wheel catching, which matched the caster she meant to swap today. At 3:19, the cart paused outside 12 East, then shifted, then kept moving toward the end of the hall. They watched for the badge reader hits that should flank every elevator entry on that floor. The system registered one badge at 3:14 from Raffi earlier, and one at 4 from a night nurse, and none for the cart. Cullum explained that carts come up with drivers who badge at the service basement, then sometimes ride with a different staffer when floors swap loads. That could account for the missing badge, and also could not. They checked the service elevator camera and caught the same cart doors sliding open at 3:16. The elevator captured a slice of reflective plastic and the edge of a sleeve, no clear face, and the time overlay blinked because of the generator test. The overlay sync had drifted last week, which Cullum was already fixing, which meant timestamps needed cross-checks against other clocks. Leora asked for a still from the moment the cart paused at 12 East. Colm printed a page with the grainy frame that showed the cart handle and a sliver of the room placard. She carried the print back to the wing and held it near the door under the light. The sliver matched the height of the placard, which confirmed little, but the angle of the cart showed the handle turned inward, which delivery staff rarely did when rolling past. She took out her moisture reader and checked the wall behind the bed. The numbers showed dry, which fit the recent mopping. She checked the strip beneath the bed casters and saw a thin gray smear that did not look like dust. She swabbed it with a clean wipe and noted a faint powdery drag on the cloth, not slippery like floor finish. She sent the wipe to Central Supply with a note asking for a basic powder test, which was really a habit from her last job at a larger facility. In that job, she once traced a peculiar residue back to construction dust tracked from a blocked stairwell, which explained an odd cough cluster that week. She had learned that small housekeeping notes sometimes solved problems everyone else framed as strange luck. By late morning, she had a sketch of the corridor on her clipboard with marks for return vents and speaker positions. Raffi walked the ceiling path and found a junction where 2 return lines met above room 15, which could create a pressure sink if one line pulled harder. He said he would check the damper blades for manual marks, then pulled down a tile and sighed at a rusted screw. "This wing is like a ship that forgot how to float," he said, which she appreciated. A nurse from 19, an older man named Keaton Ward, 49, stopped by and mentioned something from Winter. He said he heard a voice on the hall speaker one night that sounded like a whisper on a phone. Just one word that might have been wait. He filed the report with his supervisor and chalked it up to a bleed from the intercom test. He offered to show his written statement, which he kept in a folder because he kept everything. His statement matched the time when isolation overflow ended, which lined up with the damper story. Leora worked through lunch and built a timeline with the clearest markers. The service log showed an alarm at 3:12 and a linen event at 3:28. The call log showed a 1-minute station call at 3:29. The camera showed a cart at 3:19 by the hall feed with a possible overlay drift. The badge system had no hit at the elevator at 3:16, likely because of a basement badge only. None of that explained the made bed and the unplugged call light. She checked the oxygen cylinder rack in the utility room and counted 2 empties in the wrong slots. The exchange sheets said 4 full arrived yesterday afternoon, with 2 used overnight in rooms 17 and 20. That math should yield 2 full and instead showed 1, which could be a miscount or something more routine, like a cylinder staged for respiratory and not logged. She asked respiratory, who checked their sheet and said they had pulled 1 extra for a transfer that ended up canceled, and that the cylinder sat by a stairwell for 10 minutes while a therapist helped a patient. The therapist sent a note with the time, which was 3:25, which touched the period where things felt odd. By mid-afternoon, Central Supply texted back a photo of the wipe with a small note. The powder fluoresced under a standard light test in a way that fit with foot powder or a powdered latex glove residue, not construction dust. That pointed back toward a human routine, not a leak from upstairs. The note did not accuse a person, and it did not need to. She went back to 12 East and sat in a guest chair and listened. She heard the sea through glass and vents, a soft hush without rhythm. She leaned forward and spoke into the empty room, a simple line that felt like testing a bridge. If anyone adjusted your alarms to keep the peace, I will put them back where they belong. Rafi returned with a small rag of paint, marked with faded red dashes. He had found the damper blades set to a position used during winter isolation, which explained part of the quiet. He reset the blades to neutral, then ran the test tone again. The hallway speaker sounded like a real alarm finally, and two nurses popped their heads out with startled faces, which reassured her and annoyed them. They still had to explain the made bed and the unplugged cord. She checked the discharge board again and found no new names, just a morning transfer to imaging. She pulled archived calls and found another brief call at 3:31 from the same station that ended without audio, which now looked like someone purging a stuck line. Column radioed that he found a maintenance note from Winter that instructed staff to purge stale intercom channels after negative pressure resets, which nobody had repeated since. They called the linen contractor and asked about the overnight driver swap pattern. The contractor said his drivers usually wheel carts onto the elevator and ride to the target floor, but during generator tests, they sometimes stop one floor early and let a staffer guide the cart to avoid stopping between floors. He checked his dispatch sheet and found a driver note that said elevator stopped short during test, staff pushed to 12, all good. He could not give a name, only the time block. By late afternoon, the picture sharpened enough to make sense without drama. A generator test overlapped with a linen delivery and a damper setting that muffled alarms. A staffer moved a delivery cart, paused by 12 East, noticed the mop bucket, pushed the cart aside, and quickly mopped a spill. The staffer made the bed to help, then forgot the call light plug during the rush. The unplugged cord did not match best practice, which would be fixed with a reminder, not a report that accused anyone. The part that still bothered her had to do with the oxygen cylinder timing and the extra pause by the stairwell. She asked Colm to pull stairwell footage if available, which he did, and showed a therapist propping the door while holding a cylinder with one arm and shepherding a patient with the other. The patient looked steady, which matched a canceled transport returning to bed. The moment accounted for the missing cylinder, which returned to the rack at 3:43. She closed her notebook and wrote an incident review in plain language. The review recommended returning dampers to neutral after surge events, verifying hallway speaker levels during generator tests, and making a fast rule about plugging call cords before remaking any bed. She added a line about how lavender air freshener should stay out of patient rooms because it could mask odors that indicate a problem. She always added that line, and sometimes it stuck. Before she left the wing, the nurse from earlier walked up with a small, tired smile. So, not a haunting, she said. Just a lot of people doing 3 jobs at once. Leora nodded and answered with the calm confidence of someone who had stared at too many messes that looked like mysteries. It is pretty much always the simple chain, she said, and sometimes the chain gets quiet enough that nobody notices the missing link. That evening, after the emails went out, she stood by the loading dock and watched the inlet. The tide came in without hurrying, and the gulls wrote slow lines across the air that nobody would ever read. The wing would sound normal tomorrow, which meant patients would hear every beep that mattered, and staff would hear every page that counted. The quiet truth had not been a ghost, or a cover, or a headline. It had been dampers, timing, human judgment, and a hallway that swallowed sound for a while. She locked the dock door and tucked her clipboard into her bag. She would never tell the story with flair, because the unsung fixes never loved applause. She would remember the hush, though, and the way it taught her to trust the boring explanations first, then test them anyway. In a building stacked with lives and wires, truth rarely shouted. It arrived like a tide in a coastal wing, steady and patient, and loud enough once you fixed the vents. The campground incident near Flat Top Peak. A chill moved through the timbered benches below Flat Top Peak as the sun fell behind the Uinta ridgeline and wind lifted ash from abandoned rings. Campers spoke quietly while headlights swung between spruces and the lake picked a cold steel color. The host checked numbered posts, then clicked her radio once and waited for the reply that never arrived. What followed was reported plainly in dispatch logs and repeated with variations by people who kept their notes. The first person identified in records is Nora Bell, age 34, graduate researcher in wildlife biology from Salt Lake City. She drove a high-clearance wagon and told the host she planned nocturnal observation of owls along the Marsh Trail. The purpose was a weekend acoustic survey, according to archived notes found later among equipment bags. The notes included hand-drawn spectrogram lines and time windows that matched state records for a similar study nearby. The second person is Miguel Carter, age 58, seasonal campground host and retired state parks ranger from Summit County. He logged Nora's plate in a spiral notebook, then continued evening rounds with a flashlight and a quick glance toward the boat launch. He told investigators he kept the radio open on Channel 3 while checking bear lockers and fee envelopes. His statement appears in County File from 2009 that documents a previous incident involving stalled communications. The third person is Daniel Knox, age 41, an auto shop foreman from Evanston who arrived with a borrowed tent and a weekend fishing plan. He told the clerk at a gas station he wanted quiet water for early trout and an easy hike for sore knees. He parked at a pullout near the creek bend and walked a loop to count spaces, then chose a site away from the pit toilet. He mentioned to the host that he would be awake before dawn and would keep a clean camp. According to dispatch logs, a short radio test went out at 20:43 local time with no audible confirmation from the Ridge repeater. The log shows a second test at 20:49, followed by a note about weather moving from the southwest with light sleet. State records match a cold front that dropped temperatures sharply across the high basins that weekend. The campground writing board still listed fire restrictions and advised against evening travel on the Marsh Trail. Nora reportedly left a trailhead card under her windshield wiper that listed the Marsh survey starting at 21:15. She carried a headlamp with a red filter and a small recorder strapped to a shoulder pouch, plus a printed route description. The route followed the creek edge to a stand of younger spruce, then crossed a plank footbridge into sedges near the inlet. She wrote that she would return by 23 unless strong calls suggested extending the session. Miguel told investigators he saw Nora's red beam near the trail split at 21:27, which matched the time on a photo from his basic point-and-shoot camera. He said the beam faded as she turned into the sedges, and he continued to the dumpsters to secure lids from a visiting black bear. He tried again to raise the repeater, then noted in his pad that the wind shifted and the lake took a rougher texture. He returned toward the host site after hearing a single metallic clank from the boat ramp. Daniel set his tent near frost, bowed grasses, and boiled water on a small stove, then sealed food in his truck. He watched taillights at the far loop and heard the clank that Miguel later marked, which he first assumed came from a trailer chain. He walked to the vault toilet and glimpsed a dim red light moving low across cattails just above the creek mouth. He reported the light seemed steady and slow, like someone waiting carefully with both hands occupied. At 21:56, dispatch logs show a brief carrier on Channel 3 that lasted 3 seconds with no voice content captured. A second carrier appeared at 21:58 with a fractured syllable that transcribers marked as possibly the opening of a name. Records conflict on whether the carrier originated from a handheld near the campground or from a mobile unit on the highway. The repeater maintenance notes from spring testing were incomplete, and investigators never confirmed final alignment. Nora's recorder was later found on the plank bridge, with the strap pulled tight as if snagged against a rough board end. The recorder retained several minutes of wind and water noise, with 2 brief sequences that spectrogram readers flagged as unknown mechanical strikes. Some locals claimed they could hear a boat hull tapping the ramp posts when levels dropped, a seasonal condition described by the land manager. Investigators never confirmed the source, yet the tones repeated at a fixed interval on the file. Miguel reportedly checked the launch after the second carrier, then wrote that the ramp looked ordinary with fresh scrape lines near the low water mark. He found one boot print on the upper plank and two wet spots that could have been from knees or heavy packs. He radioed a traffic stop message to force the repeater to hold, then walked the shoreline toward the cattails. He carried only a small light because the bigger one was charging from a solar pack inside the host trailer. Daniel left his stove to cool and walked down the loop road while keeping his flashlight cupped to protect night vision. He called out to ask if the host needed help and heard a reply that sounded like a short yes followed by wind. He turned toward the cattails and stepped onto the first board, which dipped and rocked under his boots with a hollow noise. He stopped when he saw a dark shape rise and settle among reeds, like a sleeping bag sliding off wet grass. State records indicate a weather station near Bald Mountain reported gusts that reached 32 miles per hour between 22:05 and 22:20. The creek ran high from late snow and carried small ice crusts that clicked against stones, a sound noted in several statements. A family in the far loop heard shouting that they interpreted as normal campsite banter, which they later admitted could have been wind-pushing voices. The ambiguity continued through every account without firm correction by audio forensics. Miguel and Daniel met at the bridge at 22:11 and decided to sweep the marsh edge slowly while staying within sight of the rail. They moved 3 steps at a time, then paused to listen, then called Nora by first name with raised voices. They found the recorder wedged under the plank edge with its red indicator off, yet still warm to the touch. They agreed to return to solid ground and file a call so the county could open a search under standard protocol. The emergency call hit the log at 22:19 with a classification of overdue hiker pending weather-limited response. The coordinator in town reportedly tried to reach a volunteer on the Mirror Lake side and a deputy on the highway pullout. The deputy confirmed his unit could not cross the pass because of ice warnings, which narrowed the initial response to on-site resources. Miguel gathered 8 reflective stakes and a bag of spare tent cords to mark a safe corridor to the bridge. Archived notes describe a second search attempt by Miguel and Daniel at 22:37 that kept boots on the boards and hands on the rails. They pushed light across the sedges and saw 2 shallow channels where something heavy had parted stems toward the inlet. The channels set a direction of travel that seemed to avoid open water, then curved strangely toward a willow mound. Some locals claimed moose took that line when startled at night, a pattern mentioned often without solid tracking evidence. At 22:51, dispatch logs show a short coordination note that a hasty team from the highway side would stage at first light. The campground was advised to keep operations minimal and avoid shouting that could scramble bearings for anyone oriented by sound. Miguel set a lantern at the bridge approach while Daniel placed his truck headlights to skim the marsh surface. They stood with hands in pockets while listening to thin ice fracture on the creek bend and distant gusts across stumps. Near midnight, the temperature settled into the high 20s, and frost began to rim the plank edges with pale crystals. Daniel returned to his site to fetch a dry jacket and saw fresh condensation on his truck glass that he could not explain. He later said it looked like a palm-drawn circle that had been wiped once, which matched nothing he had touched since dinner. Investigators never confirmed the mark because frost reshaped it before photographs could fix clear detail. At first light, the team crossed the bridge in pairs and flagged a slow arc toward the willow mound, then toward a sandbar. They found Nora's field notebook under a spruce root with several pages wet and 1 page fully legible. The legible page logged a short burst of upcalls at 21:44, followed by a note about a shape in the cattails that suppressed ambient noise. The phrase appeared again later with a time mark that either read 21:58 or 21:59, depending on tilt and shadow. State records placed a snowmobile patrol on the far ridge during that hour, yet no engine echoes reached the campground through heavy air. A fisherman on the lower lake claimed to see a dim red light moving left to right for several minutes. He admitted the distance was far and the surface confused shapes, which makes the observation uncertain for timeline matching. The fisherman's statement sits in the same county file from 2009 that holds Miguel's earlier communication notes. Tracks in the sedges told little because ice crusts broke into plates that rearranged under each step and erased morning structure. A single kneeling impression near the willow mound held an imprint of a strap buckle that matched Nora's recorder harness. No other tool marks appeared, and no clear boot pairing carried beyond the mound toward the inlet or the channel edge. The absence of stride might suggest crawling, yet investigators never confirmed body position from any reliable print. By mid-morning, a dog team arrived and cast a line along the creek mouth, then across the sandbar that held gray wind ripples. The dogs showed interest near a tangle of roots where cold air pooled, but handlers reported the scent broke and scattered downslope. The team repeated the pass twice and marked the root tangle with orange tape for later careful inspection. Daniel stood back from the tape and kept his hands in pockets while his breath went long and even. Nora was located at 11:42, lying on her side in a shallow run, partially shielded by overhanging sedges that brushed the water. She was conscious and breathing slowly with hands clenched around mud and a twig caught between her fingers. She asked for a moment to clear her throat, then described a sudden pressure against her back and a rushing sound like a jet of air. Medics noted mild hypothermia and a confused timeline with gaps that covered nearly 2 hours of activity. In her later statement, Nora said she crossed the plank, then heard a faint chime that repeated at even intervals from the inlet. She thought it might be a chain bumping a metal post in shallow water, which seemed plausible given the recent drawdown. She moved toward the sound and felt the plank flex under a heavier body that seemed to move without splashing. She said the pressure was real and not panic, yet investigators never confirmed any physical contact marks on clothing. Medical checks revealed no head injury and no intoxicants, which eliminated common explanations that appear often in wilderness case summaries. The recorder file did capture the chime-like tones that she described and also caught 2 breaths that quickened after a whispered word. Transcribers could not resolve the word, and records conflict on whether it started with a consonant or a vowel. The uncertainty appears in the report margin and remained unresolved through final filing. Miguel closed the incident by returning the reflective stakes to the bin and logging a new line about repeater inconsistencies. He noted the bridge should be resurfaced before winter because the strap snag could cause a stumble when frost grows. Daniel packed his tent and drove home after leaving a note that he would return once the snow line retreated from the basin. He kept the borrowed tent folded on his back seat and avoided marsh trails for the rest of that season. The campground reopened fully in late summer with new signs that warned of variable communications during sudden weather shifts. A minor change to the ramp posts reduced chime-like contact between metal and wood as water levels fell. The change did not settle every question because some locals claimed the tones never came from the ramp, although their memories diverged. The file closed without a criminal finding, and state records list it as an incident with environmental factors and partial explanations. The story remains mostly in the margins, where wind and water make simple events feel misaligned when noted under pressure. People returned to the lake and heard ordinary clicks from ice and reeds, yet kept an ear for steady metronome sounds. They spoke lower when walking the plank bridge at night, then lifted lights to locate their feet before moving again. The incident sits between versions because investigators never confirmed the cause, and the records conflict at just the important minutes. The stories. Why this abandoned cabin had alleged proof in drywall. The story kept circling a single point about an empty cabin and a word written behind drywall. People called it proof. They did not agree on what it proved, but they repeated the word until it sounded heavy. Renata Vale was 36 and worked as a county property assessor who handled delinquent parcels. She drove a faded sedan, kept a folder of index cards, and listened to dispatch traffic. On a late spring morning, she headed to a decommissioned fishing road where a tax sale cabin sat empty. Her goal was simple and boring, which was to document storm damage before the auction and verify the interior. The cabin stood near a shallow creek with boards turned gray and a porch sag bent toward the dirt. A rusted mailbox leaned near the gate, with paint scabbed off and a number grit filmed over. Renata took photos for the file. Then she checked the back door where a hasp hung, but the lock was missing. She logged the broken hardware as prior damage, then stepped inside while the floor pressed its complaint. The incident began as a sound that did not fit the room, and then a sight. A sheet of drywall in the front room had a patch that sounded hollow when tapped. The panel was bright white against tobacco walls, and 4 black screws sat too straight and clean. She noted a faint dust halo around the joint compound, which looked newer than the rest by many years. She started a routine sweep while recording voice notes to keep the chain of events tidy. The stove held a nest of brittle twigs, the fridge was gone, and a thin mattress lay folded. Renata kept moving and counted outlets, then paused at the patched panel again. Her notes said the sheet brand looked like a type common after 2010, not the 1980s era expected here. 2 neighbors drifted by while she worked and gave versions that agreed on mood, not detail. A ranch hand named Cleo Vargas recalled sirens and smoke from 1998 when a fire line whipped through. Cleo said a man who stayed here left in a hurry and never came back, and people held a fundraiser that winter. A grocer named Benito Lake remembered men in a county truck replacing a little window about 2012, though he admitted the year could be off. Renata took their names, then asked if anyone else checked the cabin in recent years. Cleo said an insurance adjuster came by after a windstorm, and Cleo believed the woman filed a report and sealed the door. Benito said a teenager broke in 2 summers later, then a deputy taped a notice and told kids to stay away. Renata wrote both recollections as witness statements with the usual caveats about memory. She returned to the panel and looked for a reason a patch would be that clean inside this neglected shell. The screws were square drive, which was common for newer fasteners, and the spacing suggested a single small repair. The joint compound had been sanded poorly and left a telltale crescent above the seam. She ran a small flashlight along the edge and found a hair-thin line that was not paint. Her job did not include prying open walls without cause, so she called her supervisor and explained the condition. He told her to capture more context and check permits, then hold off on any invasive step until the records search. Renata agreed and left the cabin to sit with her laptop in the car while the creek talked its small talk. The county database was a stubborn thing that offered results if you knew how to ask without being greedy. She entered the parcel number and found a series of tax liens followed by a default. The permit history showed 2 entries worth attention. First, a window replacement request filed 2011, then a drywall materials purchase noted by a grant program 2015. The second entry surprised her, since the grant was designed for weatherization, not interior repairs. She cross-checked the vendor list and saw a receipt from a hardware store 3 towns away. The purchase line item said half-sheet gypsum and screws, with a date in early summer 2015. A note mentioned a volunteer crew and a case number from the sheriff office. Renata paused and rechecked the address to make sure she was not mixing properties. She downloaded everything, then called the sheriff records clerk and asked if the case number could be viewed. The clerk said the report was open public information because it involved property maintenance hours completed after a welfare check. The description said a deputy supervised a group that boarded a back window and patched a hole where a wood stove pipe had been. The deputy name was listed as J. Kravitz, with a badge number and a contact line. Renata called the number and reached a retired deputy, who answered his phone with a dry voice and correct dates. He remembered standing in that cabin while a volunteer placed a sheet over a hole, and he remembered the neighbors bringing lemonade. He also remembered boys laughing because someone had drawn a cartoon in dust above the refrigerator space. Renata thanked him and asked if any record included interior photos from that day that could be released. Kravitz said he took 3, which he felt comfortable sharing if the clerk confirmed the release path. The email reached her 10 minutes later, with 3 small images showing a too-clean patch, a bent stovepipe, and a blank wall. The timestamp read 2015, with an hour that matched late afternoon shadows. Renata zoomed in and saw the same screw pattern she had just seen in person. She returned inside with a copy of the email printed, which satisfied her need for a pre-image before touching anything. She recorded a video on her county phone, then gently ran a utility blade along the painted seam and loosened the small patch. The square drive screws turned with almost no resistance and dropped into her pocket. The board came free and showed the backside marked with pencil lines. There were 2 words in block print near the center, and a string of numbers that looked like miles or hours or both. The words read, "Tell Mara," then below them a date in words that matched late summer 2015. A thin arrow pointed toward the upper corner, where someone had tucked a sealed plastic bag with a micro SD card. Renata did not touch the bag, since she already had more than enough cause to stop and phone this in. She stepped back and spoke to her phone, as if it were a witness who needed comfort rather than patience. She said she had an evidentiary find, likely tied to a case report from 2015, and she described the board condition. She then called her supervisor and said she would hold position and request a deputy to document chain of custody. Her voice felt steady, which helped, and the creak still talked. The responding deputy arrived from the nearest substation and followed a familiar script at a deliberate pace. He photographed the panel, bagged the micro SD card, then requested a second unit to confirm signatures. He also asked Renata to repeat her steps for his body camera, which she did, and her voice stayed calm. He wrote "Tell Mara" in his notebook and underlined the date, then asked about any person by that name in the area. Cleo returned when he saw the cruiser and stood at the fence with a careful expression that suggested curiosity and worry. He said a woman named Mara used to work at the gas station near the highway, and she moved inland after the big fire. He believed she dated the man who once stayed at this cabin, whose name people rarely said anymore. Cleo said the man had a brother who fought with him over debt, which was rumor, and old rumor at that. Renata kept the witness statement straight and did not chase speculation, because theory makes friendly noise but muddies facts. The deputy asked dispatch to check archived calls around late summer 2015 for any mention of the station or the creek. Dispatch later replied that an incomplete emergency call pinged a tower near the old highway with a man's voice saying "wrong truck" before the line died. The call was never connected again, and the dispatch note listed a response that found nothing conclusive on the road. The investigators gathered all of this and began to lay a clean map of what the drywall might mean. The board was patched during a small volunteer day led by Deputy Kravitz, who remembered no note then because the drywall face was clean. The writing was on the backside, so whoever wrote "Tell Mara" likely wrote before installation or wrote during installation and then faced the board inward. The micro SD card fit the same logic, since it had to be tucked away before final screws. The sheriff tech opened the bag carefully and previewed the card on a laptop while Renata stood near the doorway. The card held a few small files and one audio clip that was less than a minute long, with a man breathing hard. A voice said "Mara." Then there was a scrape sound. Then the voice said, "Wrong truck? Check mile marker 12. Then silence. The text said the file metadata matched a late summer date, 2015, which matched the pencil note. The deputy asked Benito about mile 12, and Benito said a vanished reflector stood near a turnout everyone used for tire chains. He said the place was not on maps, but everyone knew it by a crooked pine and a faded mile stencil. A second unit drove there and found an old-cut bank with broken bottles and a rusted number plate choked by vines. That team then called for a grid walk and a metal sweep, which turned up a torn piece of a license frame. County records later produced an abandoned truck report filed by a salvage yard in early fall 2015. The report said a pickup had been moved by a private tow from a turnout before a storm and later sold for parts. The tow ticket listed a different mile marker by mistake, likely copied wrong by the driver, and the ticket names were hard to read. The salvage manager admitted their clerk sometimes took shortcuts with paperwork when storms crowded the yard. A detective interviewed the retired tow driver and asked for his memory of the pickup and its condition after the call. The driver said he remembered an empty truck with a broken rear glass and a tarp inside that smelled like gasoline. He said 2 men met him at the turnout and pointed to a path, and he signed a work order that he no longer had. He said he remembered a gold wedding band on a chain near the shifter, which he placed in a cup holder out of caution. The audio clip and the drywall note nudged the case from rumor to a timeline that had context and checkable waypoints. The incomplete call in 2015 used the words wrong truck, which matched the audio and echoed through dispatch records. The mild repair day in 2015 created a perfect stage for a message that only a future visitor might find. The instruction tell Mara suggested the writer knew a specific person would eventually hear about the cabin again. Renata learned that temp crews sometimes used whatever board they had in the truck, which could explain the face-inward mistake. A volunteer might have grabbed a sheet with a pencil note from the stack without thinking, then installed it with the note hidden. Another possibility was that the writer meant to hide the message, assuming a person who cared would eventually come prying. Both options fit the facts, and neither required creative leaps that could not be defended in a report. A second pass through the micro SD card revealed a photo of a dashboard with a gas station logo seen through the windshield. The date stamp matched the summer of 2015, and the triangle logo was the old brand used before a sale. Benito confirmed that the station repainted their canopy that autumn, which inadvertently confirmed the window of time. The detail felt small and almost petty, yet it anchored the sequence to a real week. The detective contacted the station owner, who produced archived night logs showing a purchase by a prepaid card at 11:42. A print from the receipt showed a pack of ice and a cheap burner phone that matched the model seen in the photo. The clerk on duty had long since moved, though a manager remembered a man who returned twice that night to borrow tape. He said he thought the man looked scraped up, and he remembered a truck with a blue fender and a white tailgate. A family member of the man who stayed at the cabin identified the voice on the audio as a high likelihood match. They provided an older voicemail that had similar breathing patterns when the man climbed hills for fun on weekends. The sheriff office sent both clips to a regional lab, which returned a cautious report that said the two voices were likely related. The lab kept the language safe, which made sense, because certainty in audio work is often impossible. The drywall word itself caused arguments in corners where the story traveled faster than any memo could hope to move. People liked the part where the house was silent for years while a small message waited for a careful hand. Some said the word proof made sense because the voice was clearly him, and because the date matched the summer when he vanished. Others said proof is for courtrooms and journals, and this was only a lead until tested. Renata held her own view, which was that houses keep small time capsules without meaning to, and sometimes that matters. She had seen children's names carved into baseboards under carpet and grocery lists folded under a sink. She had also seen unsafe wiring stuffed into a cereal box and tucked inside a wall, and the box told its own story. People leave messages wherever they can, hoping someone decent will listen someday when it counts. The case shifted again when a trail crew found a piece of a phone shell near mile marker 11 during a separate survey. The shell matched the burner model bought that night, and nearby crews found a patch of old stain on the soil. A lab swab reported that the residue was fuel, which was consistent with the tow driver memory of gasoline smell in the truck. A chain of steps formed that linked the turnout, the audio clip, and the tow yard path. Mara was located by a social worker who knew 3 different last names for her from utility records. She met with investigators in a room that smelled like coffee, that had been reheated many times and left to think. She said she had not heard from him since that summer, and she cried in a way that was lightless but dry. When told about the drywall note, she put her head down and whispered that he tried to fix things and always left notes. She agreed to listen to the clip, then nodded and said the words were his when he felt cornered by debt and fear. She said wrong truck made sense because his brother drove a similar model and people mixed them up when angry. She said mile 12 meant the turnout where they used to watch road crews because he loved slow machines more than sleep. She asked if the word proof meant she could stop imagining him as a ghost in every passing pickup. The detective did not promise anything, which was the right call, and said the message mattered more than rumor. Mara said that was good enough for now and asked if she could visit the cabin to see the panel with her own eyes. Renata met her there with Cleo and Benito nearby, and they all stood quiet while the creek kept talking. Mara touched the pencil words like a fingertip prayer, then laughed once, small and sudden, because the handwriting was his. The county eventually sold the parcel to a quiet bidder who planned to reclaim lumber and leave the footprint for a garden. Before the sale, the sheriff office returned the panel to the property with a sealed sleeve that covered the message. A small plaque nailed to a beam recorded the date in words and the name of the deputy who first supervised repairs. It did not use the word proof, which felt right, because the wall was more than a verdict. Reporters asked Renata if she believed the drywall solved anything that mattered, and she answered with careful honesty and patience. She said it solved whether the cabin hid a message, and it offered a direction for facts to continue breathing. She said the board changed a rumor cloud into a line of checkable points that connected people who had waited years. She also said that what you call proof depends on the room you are standing in and the weight on your heart. The story kept circulating, and people kept walking that turnout and counting the faded stencils with respect and quiet. They looked for signs that someone had tried to speak in a tight corner and had chosen an odd messenger. They bent close to drywall, then stepped back and saw a small room that finally felt less like a tomb. They understood that time can hide a message, and sometimes the wall just needs a steady hand and a simple blade. When Renata thinks about the cabin now, she remembers the hush when the board came free and the pencil marks appeared. She remembers Cleo and Benito telling careful pieces and retired Deputy Kravitz recalling lemonade in a little paper cup. She remembers that proof is a rough word for a gentle thing, which is a voice asking someone to tell a person named Mara. She believes the house did what houses sometimes do, which is hold a note until the right listener finally arrives. The stories. Night guard who logged footsteps, no camera recorded. The guard wrote down 8 distinct bouts of footsteps inside an empty building, and the cameras showed nothing all night. 2 separate motion sensors tripped near the same hallway, yet playback displayed a silent corridor with only the exit sign glow. His name was Barrett Lorme, 42, a night security officer at a regional logistics hub off a county road. The building sat between a rail spur and a belt of trees, and the company shipped auto parts and appliances. Barrett worked the 10 to 6 shift in a brown uniform that always smelled faintly of dust and coffee. He carried a flashlight, a radio, and a phone that hooked into a dispatch line, and he liked the quiet. He had a simple goal that Tuesday night in early spring, finish his rounds and sign off incident-free by dawn. He had brought a thermos of soup and a paperback, planning to spend the downtime in the small control room. He checked the weather and watched rain move in thin sheets across the lot lights. He thought about replacing his shoes, since the tread had started to squeal on polished tile. The incident started just after midnight, when he heard measured steps across the second-floor mezzanine. He was finishing a log entry about a storm alert, and the sound came clean and steady through the ceiling. He checked camera feeds for the mezzanine, but the screens showed still aisles and palleted boxes. He grabbed his light and his radio, and he headed for the stairs with the practiced calm of routine. At the mezzanine, he found that familiar quiet hum from the conveyors, a noise that never truly stopped. The footsteps repeated behind him, like someone matching his pace near the rail that overlooked receiving. He pivoted fast, saw only empty air and a red light blinking on a camera dome. He walked the length of the aisle while noting the time, and every time he paused, the steps seemed to pause. He logged the first occurrence at 12:15, wrote down the location, and continued his route. On the next pass, he heard them again near the battery storage closet, crisp against the concrete. He spoke into his radio, more for procedure than comfort, and announced that he was investigating a possible trespass. He found the closet locked and the seal unbroken, which did not help his nerves. From the control room, recordings later showed a hallway with nothing but reflected light pooling against steel doors. The microphones in that area were old and tinny, yet they caught a faint rhythm that matched walking. The time code on the feed read 12:18, which matched his scribbled note from the clipboard. He wrote a second entry because repeated anomalies meant paperwork, and paperwork meant patience. By 1:20, the steps had moved to the long corridor past the break room, and Barrett felt the hairs rise on his arms. He had switched to his backup flashlight after the primary started to flicker, which made the hallway feel longer. He called dispatch on the archived line and requested a patrol swing through the outer lot, which sounded more confident than he felt. The dispatcher logged it and told him to stay on channel, which he did while walking slow. Around 2, the rain intensified, and the roof drums sent soft rolls through the rafters that sounded like distant carts. Barrett tried to isolate the sound by standing still, counting under his breath, then moving again. The footsteps returned with the same cadence each time, never rushing, never trailing off, like a metronome following his heel. He marked the third and fourth occurrences, and the sheet started to look like a pattern. He started to reconstruct the history of the building in his head in that practical way that guards do when bored. The hub had been expanded twice, and the mezzanine had been added after the original slab settled. A retired manager once said the second floor carried sound, strangely because the joists had been spliced during a shutdown. That small detail stuck now because odd structure often equals odd sound, and odd sound confuses cameras. He decided on an internal check of maintenance records, so he dug into a filing cabinet near the back wall. He found a binder labeled Floor Vibration Studies, stamped with a date from 2009 and signed by an engineer. He skimmed line items and saw mention of a resonance under certain loads and a recommended brace that was never installed. He took a photo on his phone, more habit than plan, then heard the steps again behind the door. He opened the door fast and swung the light through dust and metal shelves, and nothing moved. He stepped inside, closed the door, and waited until the air felt heavier, then walked, which pulled the sound along like a shadow. He spoke low into his radio and said, "Test." And he heard a soft reply through the ceiling that sounded like his own voice. He marked the fifth occurrence, then circled the time twice because the echo trick felt wrong. Barrett called the shift supervisor at home, a man named Gilles, and left a calm message. He explained that sensors popped twice, cameras showed clear, but audio suggested movement that matched his pace. He asked permission to halt one conveyor and test the mezzanine with the motor silent, since noise masking can complicate readings. He set the phone down and sipped soup while rain hit the window like static. The lot patrol rolled in at 2:30, and a deputy named Ames checked doors with a bright light and gentle humor. Ames wore a jacket that looked older than the car, and he liked to tease Barrett about hobby detective work. He came inside, listened near the break room, and heard the steps when Barrett moved, then nodded like a man hearing an old song. He wrote a short note on a card and suggested they check the time sync on the cameras. Barrett pulled up the system configuration, and a small detail finally jumped out where he had not looked. The network video recorder had synced to a time source that shifted during a recent firmware update. The correct setting had moved to a secondary tab, and the cameras were drifting a minute and a half slow during overnight resets. He compared timestamps against the dispatch call log, and the mismatch explained one gap, but not all gaps. He pulled out old handheld footage from training drills, which he kept on a thumb drive for new hires. A clip from 2019 showed a tour up the same staircase on a quiet Sunday night. The trainer had mentioned that the mezzanine acted like a drum when a person moved near the expansion joint. In the background, steps mirrored the instructor in perfect time, and the camera, pointed into the void, recorded nothing but sound. Witness statements from shipping staff added another layer. Since people love to tell small tech stories when asked kindly, a forklift driver said the mezzanine cameras had been moved 2 years earlier after a near miss with a swinging hoist. The new angles covered the rails and aisles, but created a narrow dead zone where a parapet shadow swallowed detail. The guard had never noticed because no one had reported anything in that exact strip. At 3:15, Barrett and Ames did a careful test. Treating the building like a patient with a stubborn cough, Barrett walked 5 paces, paused, walked 5, paused, and Ames watched monitors and marked everything on a yellow pad. The audio track caught consistent taps that matched the shoes, and the video showed an empty frame right where the parapet shadow lived. The dead zone was only 3 feet wide, yet it covered the spot where the resonance amplified best. They tried the same thing with the conveyor powered down, and the pattern grew clearer and less masked. Without the motor hum, the sound felt sharper, as if the building had pulled back a curtain, yet the frame still looked clean. Ames snapped his fingers and said, "That right there is our ghost. If a ghost paid rent and liked stairs." Barrett smiled without meaning to, then told him he would still file the incident by the book. He went back to the maintenance binder and took a second photo of a page about a brace that was never installed. The engineer had recommended a crossmember at the joint to dampen a known frequency that matched walking strides. In one margin, someone had written a note about budget carryover that probably killed the fix with a shrug. He put that in his notes with a plain line that said, "Brace never added, resonance persists during light traffic." The sixth occurrence came while he wrote that sentence. Like the building wanted to underline the point, he recorded the time, then cross-checked it against the corrected system time on the recorder, and they finally aligned. He realized the worst part was not the sound, but the way uncertainty stretched time during long nights. He spoke aloud to the empty hallway and said, "That is enough now," which felt silly but oddly steadying. He kept investigating because good habits make future nights easier, which matters more than a single scare. He printed the camera layout and traced the dead zone with a highlighter, then labeled each motion sensor with its field of view. He checked battery dates because a dying sensor can behave like a jumpy cat, and both batteries were fresh from last month. He called the day supervisor and left a second message with a tighter summary. The seventh and eighth occurrences happened as a pair near 4, right when shift change trucks started rumbling past the fence line. The steps matched his route exactly. Yet the sound slid forward and backward based on where he stood near the rail. He pictured the mezzanine as a guitar body that needed a finger pressed lightly on a string to quiet a note. He thought about the brace again, and he made a final note that felt like an instruction. When Gilles called back just before 5, Barrett kept his tone normal and direct. Gilles asked if he needed an officer to sit inside until the sun came up, and Barrett said they were fine now. He explained the misaligned timestamps and the dead zone shadow and the resonance sheet that read like a forgotten to-do. Gilles sighed, then said to write it clean and attach the photos to the morning inbox. Barrett did that line by line, treating the log as a small map for the next person. He wrote that witnesses heard the sound during training in 2019 and that maintenance had never added the brace. He wrote that the camera angles needed a minor shift to close the dead zone near the parapet. He added that the network recorder needed a corrected time source to prevent drift during overnight resets. He included a note about the patrol deputy who observed the sound and saw clean frames. Because outside eyes help, he kept the language careful and dry, avoiding drama, sticking to facts he could show later without wobble. He attached phone photos of the binder pages, the highlighted camera layout, and his clipboard entries that matched the sensor alerts. He finished by recommending a temporary closure of the area until the brace could be installed. Sunrise cleaned the edges of everything, and the building felt ordinary again, which was a relief he did not say. The rain slowed, and a gull rode the wind over the rail spur, which made him laugh at himself for being jumpy. He locked the mezzanine door and placed a bright cone at the landing, because simple signals beat superstition every time. He poured the last of his soup into a paper cup and let the steam warm his nose. When the day shift filed in, Barrett handed the report to the receptionist and nodded to the warehouse lead. He told the lead to keep people off the mezzanine except for essential work, and the lead agreed with a tired salute. Ames waved from his car and drove off with the easy confidence of a man satisfied by a solvable problem. The place returned to its ordinary clatter, which was the best sound in the world that morning. In the weeks that followed, the company installed the missing brace and retuned the camera angles by a small degree. A contractor ran a new line to the time source, then logged the change and initialed the tab with a neat signature. The steps never reappeared in the same way, according to follow-up notes and archived calls from later shifts. Barrett replaced his shoes and kept working nights, because quiet had always been the goal. If anyone asked about the story, he told it straight, and he never padded the edges to make it spooky. He said that buildings remember their mistakes in the shape of their echoes, and a cheap fix can teach a loud lesson. He said that cameras can lie without malice if someone nudges their clocks or points them an inch left. He said that good logs can save an hour of fear, which felt true every time he wrote a line. By summer, the mezzanine felt like any other walkway. Not a drum, not a stage, not a mirror for footsteps. The report lived in a drawer with other small sagas of night work, each one patient and plain. Barrett liked that the truth did not need big words or legends, just careful notes and people who read them. He had found the sound and given it a reason, and the reason made the building quiet again. The stories. Paramedic returned a ring to this hospital wing. The ring sat in a small evidence pouch with a folded intake label, and the label named "This Hospital Wing." Security logged the delivery in the overnight book with a careful time, and they filmed the handoff at the ambulance bay. Calder Ruiz was 34, and he worked nights on a private ambulance that covered the mixed urban fringe. He drove a high-mileage rig with a sticky rear latch, and he kept a quiet notebook under the dash. He finished paperwork after sunrise when the cafeteria coffee tasted burnt and the elevators finally ran without packed gurneys. His simple plan for this morning made sense, and it fit the tired mood of the shift. He would drop the ring, sign the property line, and clock out before the traffic built. The ring was a plain yellow band with a shallow engraving, and the engraving read LK and May 14. He did not remember any patient who mentioned jewelry, and their overnight calls were ordinary transfers and one shortness of breath. The band came from under the bench cushion during cleanup, and he spotted it when a pen rolled and tapped. He pocketed the pouch because it felt wrong to leave it, and he headed for the East Wing desk. The East Wing used to hold telemetry and a step-down, and now it served as a rehab overflow when beds ran tight. The desk kept a property log from older times, and the same binder continued through years of tape and patchwork pages. The unit clerk looked at the label and frowned, and she called for the charge nurse by habit. The charge nurse checked the overnight admits and shook her head, and she said nothing matched a ring for this wing. She asked which patient lost it, and he told her none of their patients mentioned a ring at all. She said they could place it in central security, and they would open a claim if anyone asked later. He nodded but felt a tug, and the label still named this wing in plain handwriting. He asked if the desk ever handled stray property like that, and the charge nurse said it occasionally happened. A maintenance tech leaned from a ladder and listened, and he said the East Wing had its own ghosts by reputation. He laughed when the nurse shot a look, and he added that he meant the cardboard kind. He explained that old property envelopes sometimes turned up behind cabinets, and housekeeping would move them along. He said linens and small items traveled strange paths when movers closed floors, and people forgot until someone asked later. Calder thanked him, then he asked permission to check the binder for older notations. The clerk slid it over and pointed to a rule that said deliveries needed 2 staff signatures. The binder held thick pages with names and room numbers, and some entries noted patient transfers to other wings. Calder skimmed recent weeks and then months, and nothing showed the initials LK, or any ring notes. He asked if the wing ever logged items that did not belong to current patients, and the clerk said rarely. She remembered a wedding band that fell through a bed frame on a weekend, and it took months to track. She said a therapist found it during a lift motor replacement, and the family cried when they got the call. The clerk shrugged and said the hospital felt like a moving chest of drawers, and odds and ends migrated forever. Calder walked to security with the pouch, and the guard on duty scanned the label with a handheld. The guard said the pouch style looked older, and the zip strip color was not used anymore. The guard printed the receipt and asked for a description, and Calder gave the engraving as clearly as possible. The guard searched a property database and found no ring tickets for the wing, and his search covered 2 years by default. Calder asked if there were archived losses in older years, and the guard said records before 2014 were scanned PDFs. The guard called upstairs and requested access to a shared drive, and the wait felt like a small eternity. Calder stood under the camera bubble and reviewed his shift notes, and the notes listed 4 dispatch times with addresses redacted here. He wrote a short line about a transfer from a rehab floor with a pleasant dog calendar, and he wrote another about a night custodian who kept a radio. None of the lines mentioned a ring, and none of the patients wore jewelry in obvious ways. He opened his phone gallery and checked the bench photo he took for restocking, and the timestamp matched their return to the bay. The ring did not appear in that picture, and the bench looked clean and dull. He wondered if the ring slid loose after the photo when the rig shuddered, and the thought did not settle his nerves. The guard waved him back and offered a chair, and they opened a folder of ripped black and white scans. One report flagged an incident in the East Wing, and the date read May 14 of 2010. The note said a patient property bag failed during a bed change, and a ring listed as L.K. went missing. The report said staff searched the room, and linen hampers were checked in central processing. A second note added that the family could not be reached, and a voicemail box stayed full for weeks. The case closed without resolution, and the scan ended with a faded stamp that looked handmade. Calder felt the small click that happens when separate lines meet, and the label suddenly seemed heavier than its weight. He asked if the room number was legible, and the guard zoomed until the pixels turned into blocks. The number looked like 212 or 217, and the wing layout had changed since then. The guard said maintenance might have an old map, and a shop supervisor kept binders in a cage downstairs. Calder thanked him, and he asked to make a quick copy of the scan for his crew file. The guard printed the page and stamped a copy line, and he urged Calder to keep things simple with the wing. On the loading dock, a housekeeper pushed a rolling cart, and she mentioned hearing about a ring on the radio. She said her aunt worked here years ago as a transporter, and her aunt remembered a family who asked about LK. The aunt thought LK stood for Lena Kovacs, and that name showed up on a donor plaque somewhere. The housekeeper stressed that it was just a memory, and people mixed up stories after long shifts. Calder thanked her and asked which plaque she meant, and she guessed it could be by the therapy gym. He made a note with a star, and he promised nothing beyond a respectful check. Maintenance loaned him a binder with a taped spine, and the old East Wing diagram showed rooms from 190 to 230. A paper tab marked a wall removal year in 2005, and the spaces had been reconfigured since that renovation. The diagram showed linen chutes and mechanical closets, and one chute lined up behind the current rehab gym. Calder compared the faded room to a modern corner, and the old room 212 would be near the therapy office. He felt the workable line appear, and it had more gears than luck. He thanked the supervisor and returned the binder, and he set off toward the gym. The therapy office had a bulletin board with service pins, and a small photo showed a woman in scrubs named Kovacs. A caption said she ran a staff fundraiser in 2011, and the photo looked like a copy of a copy. Calder asked the receptionist if Miss Kovacs still worked there, and the receptionist said she retired years ago. The receptionist checked a directory and found no current contact, and then she opened a drawer with old alumni notes. She found a folded program from a memorial tea, and the newsletter said, "Lena Kovacs lost a husband early." The print used careful language, and it did not mention the ring or the initials. Calder felt a chill that did not belong to superstition, and he asked security if he could call the number on the old scan. The guard said the number probably died years ago, and he recommended the hospital volunteer office for family links. Calder went there and explained the situation, and he kept details minimal and careful. The volunteer coordinator listened and nodded, and then she showed him a book of donor inscriptions. She pointed at a plaque near the rehab gym, and the name said Kovacs Family Therapy Garden with a small leaf icon. She said the family sometimes visited during late summer, and she could pass a message through a general email. Calder returned to the East Wing desk and asked again to log the ring, and he added the old report number on the form. The charge nurse read his notes and raised an eyebrow, and she asked whether this was a lost patient or a lost object. Calder answered it was certainly an object, and he was trying to avoid making anyone hurt again. She stared at the band through the plastic and then nodded, and she initialed the line for custody. She called linen services and requested a search of older chutes, and she asked maintenance about a recent vibration test nearby. She then told Calder she appreciated the thoroughness, and she would add her number to the receipt. On his lunch break that arrived at almost noon, Calder called his partner from the shift and asked about the bench cushion. His partner said the cushion ripped months ago near the latch, and small things sometimes fell into that hollow void. He said he once lost a pen that rolled out 3 weeks later, and they both laughed about the gremlins. Calder asked if any hospital staff had borrowed their transport stretcher recently, and his partner said rehab used it during a power test yesterday. The partner said the rehab techs pushed the stretcher over a threshold that made the whole thing shudder. Calder pictured the ring jumping free inside the cushion, and the moment drew a simple line through time. He walked to biomedical engineering and asked about the rehab stretcher loan, and the tech on duty pulled an asset report. The report showed a loan to the East Wing therapy office, and the return time matched their arrival last night. The tech said the stretcher had a known rattle in the side rail, and small items could migrate if they slipped. Calder requested permission to inspect the rail, and the tech handed over a hex key with a cautious smile. He removed the end cap and tipped the rail, and a dust mix fell with a soft hiss. Nothing else emerged, and the ring hypothesis remained just that. and yet it still felt reasonable. Calder tried laundry services next and asked whether a ring could travel from a chute to a truck and back. The supervisor said it happened rarely, and a ring could ride a torn bag to a cart and escape later. The supervisor said older chutes sometimes released surprises when motors kicked, and vibration made lost things walk. She said one time a pager chimed from a folded blanket, and everyone jumped because the model was ancient. She wrote down the ring details and promised to ask her staff, and she asked for the property receipt number. Calder thanked her and climbed the stairs because the elevator seemed suddenly crowded. A retired nurse named Myra arrived for a flu shot, and she recognized the old pouch design at the east desk. She said those pouches vanished after 2012, and she used to seal them with a blue strip. She looked at the initials and stopped, and she softly said Lena kept her maiden name for work. She remembered a shift when a patient requested a chaplain, and afterward a ring went missing from the bag. She said they turned the room upside down and found nothing, and she cried telling the family that week. She asked whether the ring was truly here now, and the charge nurse said it was in security as of this morning. Calder asked whether Myra could share a statement, and she agreed to write a short note with dates as best she could. Her handwriting looked steady for a long history, and she described a bed change and a linen swap. She recalled a code earlier that day in a nearby room, and equipment had moved through the hallway quickly. She said carts piled up while everyone managed the chaos, and the chute doors swung as orderlies cleared hampers. She noted that Lena worked that corridor and often stayed late, and she kept paperwork near the therapy office. Myra ended by saying the family did not push a complaint, and the grief felt huge enough already. Calder added the note to the property file, and he asked security to copy the PDF and the asset report. The guards stapled everything carefully and wrote a short chain of custody line, and then he called his supervisor. The supervisor arrived and listened without interruption, and he nodded at each small connective piece. He said it sounded plausible that the ring traveled by linen or by stretcher rail, and the return timing fit. He asked whether anyone had reached the Kovacs family, and the volunteer office answered that a general email was sent. He decided the ring should be placed with the wing director for now, and then returned when the family responded. Calder walked the ring to the wing director with the charge nurse, and the director unlocked a small safe by the desk. The director read the file twice and looked out at the therapy gym, and he seemed to count years without words. He thanked Calder for not turning this into a story beyond the facts, and he said the path felt honest. He said sometimes the building kept tiny traps from old renovations, and objects slid back into daylight when ready. He placed the ring pouch on a velvet pad, and he wrote the time and his name with a careful hand. He said they would hold the ring in the wing, and they would make sure the right people heard. That afternoon, a volunteer returned with a printed email, and the message contained a phone number that still worked. The director asked Calder to stay as a witness, and they called the number on speaker in a quiet office. A woman answered and identified herself as Mira, and she said she was Lena's niece by marriage. She listened to the summary and asked a few precise questions, and her voice shook on the second. She said her aunt still wore a thin band and a chain, and this sounded like her husband's original ring. She said the family visited the garden plaque every May, and they never stopped asking about a lost ring. They met in a neutral conference room with frosted glass, and the director set the pouch on the table. Mira brought a small photo from 2010, and the ring in the picture looked like the one in the pouch. She asked to hold it for a moment, and then she breathed as if she had been underwater too long. She pointed to a tiny scratch on the inner edge, and it matched a bike fall from their early years together. She explained that the initials were his and hers, and the date marked the wedding by a justice in a quiet office. She thanked the room and said she did not want a ceremony, and she was just grateful for care. Calder signed the witness line and pushed the pen toward the director, and the moment felt weightless and plain. Mira asked whether anyone would mind if she visited the therapy garden, and the director offered to walk her there. She asked if the ring could remain with the wing for a little while, and she wanted to place flowers first. The director said the wing would be honored, and he promised to contact her if any details surfaced later. Calder stood back and watched the distance between grief and closure collapse, and it looked like a hallway finally cleared. He nodded to the charge nurse and pocketed his notebook, and he promised to replace the bench cushions soon. 2 days later, the linen supervisor called Calder and said a tech found a torn seam in the stretcher cover. The tear ran along a hidden edge that opened under vibration, and small things could hide there without notice. The tech also found a coin lodged deep inside, and its date hit the same era noted in the file. The supervisor said this was not proof of the ring path, and it felt like a friendly witness. Calder took a picture of the seam and added it to the binder, and he logged the maintenance request for replacement. The small chain of custody now included the rail and the cover, and the line grew stronger without pretending certainty. The wing director arranged a short gathering by the therapy garden, and a few staff who remembered Lena came by. They set a small card that said, "Returned to the East Wing," and they left space for a family decision. Mira arrived with her 2 cousins and a bouquet, and she asked if she could speak to the gathered staff. She thanked everyone for treating the story with hands open, and she said the ring could stay displayed for 1 week. After that week, she would take it home, and she would bring it back every May as a quiet practice. People nodded because the balance felt right, and the garden bench caught the late light gently. Calder watched from the edge with his coffee, and he remembered the pin that tapped the bench before he saw the ring. He thought about the way buildings hold on to things, and how people read meaning into dust and echo. He thought about dispatch logs that look cold until someone traces them, and then the script becomes a real day. He considered the lines that join strangers into an honest arc, and he respected each break where evidence speaks. The ring did not prove fate, and it did prove persistence, and it showed that care can be methodical. He left the garden before the applause faded, and he headed for the bay to start another shift. On his next overnight run, he noticed the new bench cushion, and it no longer swallowed dropped pens into hiding. He kept his notebook on the dash and wrote a line about the East Wing, and he kept the words simple. He wrote that a ring once traveled the hospital like a seed on wind, and the wind finally stopped here. He wrote that people made that stop happen by checking maps and calling quietly, and by not rushing a story. He wrote that the wing felt different now, and the difference came from patience more than any grand event. He closed the book and turned on the radio, and the night answered with the ordinary sound of work. Weeks later, the director sent a copy of a small framed note, and it now sat by the garden plaque. The note stated that a staff family recovered a long-missing ring, and it had rested here for a time. It stated that the return involved a paramedic, a clerk, a guard, a supervisor, and a retired nurse. It added that the file included a torn stretcher cover and a scan dated May 14 of 2010. It invited no legend and made no claim beyond the chain of quotes and receipts, and it felt right that way. Calder clipped the note into his shift binder and smiled, and then he got called out for a routine transfer. On the way past the East Wing doors, he slowed and looked in, and the desk lamp made the binder glow. The charge nurse raised a hand without words, and the unit seemed calm in the bright noon. He thought again about how evidence moves on small wheels and how the best stories stay quiet when finished. He considered how many families carry unclosed lines and how sometimes a lost object can stitch one shut. He knew this ring did not solve grief, and it gave shape to a memory that had gone thin with years. He swung the rig into the daylight and felt the road through the wheel, and the city rolled forward like usual. Months later, he learned that Mira returned each May with flowers, and she touched the glass with the ring inside. The volunteer office kept the file updated in a narrow drawer, and the drawer label read East Wing Recoveries. Security replaced the camera bubble over the bay and kept the old unit for parts, and they joked about relics. The maintenance supervisor finally tossed the torn cover after documenting it, and he felt oddly proud of the careful record. The hospital moved through another winter without big headlines, and the garden kept the same soft wind under the windows. Calder kept working nights and never chased mention, and the crew understood without any speech at all. He still told new hires one short version during checkout, and he kept the details clear of romance. He said a ring with initials LK turned up under a bench after a stretcher loan, and the label named this wing. He said the date on the old report matched the engraving, and the linen path explained the long delay. He said good records and patient calls made the circle close, and that promise is why they log everything. He said someone cried without making a scene, and that is how truth usually presents itself at work. Then he pointed to the property pouch drawer and the fresh bench cushion, and he told them to check twice. Calder visited the garden once more after a busy night, and he stood alone before the building woke completely. He watched sun slide across the plaque letters until the leaf icon warmed, and the quiet felt unearned and good. He thought of how small choices build bridges that do not announce themselves, and then one step reveals the span. He remembered a retired nurse who wrote a careful line and a housekeeper who shared a family guess. He remembered a guard who kept files neat and a director who knew not to fill silence. He placed his palm on the cool railing and chose no grand meaning, and he simply wished everyone a gentle day. The ring returned to this hospital wing by documented steps, and the steps were ordinary and human and steady. The story did not need a mystery beyond time and movement, and it showed how rooms keep modest promises. He considered that a bench cushion, a torn cover, and a faded scan can hold a family together again. He thought that is enough for any place built to heal, and he walked back to the bay without speaking. He started the rig and checked the lights, and the reflections blinked across the wet asphalt. He breathed, then he rolled toward the morning traffic, and the work met him with the same quiet weight. The stranger, found in Larch Hollow. Neighbors along the Ridge Road reported a lone man standing in Larch Hollow before dawn, motionless and facing uphill. Mara Keene, 42, forestry technician, entered the ravine after first light to review storm wash and assess slope instability after weekend rain. She carried a handheld GPS and a laminated soils map, and she kept a basic trauma kit near her waist. The county had seen minor slides last winter, and supervisors wanted fresh notes before crews reopened seasonal trails. Her purpose was routine and documented, and she said the air felt colder than the forecast given by local radio. Her field book later recorded a penciled line reading, reportedly still there, written before she claimed she ever saw anyone. Larch Hollow cuts across the eastern shoulder of Coos County, Oregon, where the timber plots crowd a narrow creek that bends twice. Old survey stakes lean at odd angles, and blackberry thickets press against a discontinuous game trail that drops toward the water. In autumn, the alder leaves slick the soil and runoff threads between roots, carrying silt that clouds the creek for hours. Mara knew the turns by sight and sound, and she logged wind direction and a faint diesel odor that never matched nearby traffic. Dispatch logs from the same morning noted no road graders, and state records listed no permitted logging within 3 miles. She reported hearing a human voice near the first dogleg, measured at 40 paces from a flagged snag she had marked last month. The voice was low and even, as if reading from a page that had been folded and kept dry inside a coat. She followed the sound to a pocket of firs that cut the breeze, and she saw a man standing without any gear or pack. He looked around, 50, medium build, clean hands, a button shirt with stitched initials. No one later matched to any business in the county. Some locals claimed such shirts got sold in a church thrift near the bay, but investigators never confirmed the inventory. Mara addressed him as if he were a hiker who had lost the trail, and she kept her tone slow, with her palms open. He did not answer at first, then he said he had come to return a thing he had borrowed, and he glanced downslope. She asked whether he needed help, or water, or a radio call, and he said none of those would help at that hour. Her watch showed 8:17, and she wrote that detail twice, a habit she kept when she worried her timing might be challenged later. Records conflict on whether she then stepped closer or whether the man closed the distance by 2 careful paces. Deputy Saul Redding, 51, County Sheriff's Office, received a welfare call around 8:30, routed through the non-emergency line from a neighbor. Dispatch logs placed him in town refueling, and the drive time to the ridge was 20 minutes if the road stayed dry. He knew the hollow for trespass complaints across 2019 and 2020, usually hunters edging property lines during early fall. He headed out alone, and he radioed a routine field check with no known hazard beyond slick leaves and a soft shoulder. His purpose was to contact any person in distress and to verify no unauthorized vehicles had been left at the upper gate. Mara recorded the man's name as either Laird or Lyle, written with a slant that later complicated forensic enhancement by the lab. She asked for a last name, and he again said he came to return a borrowed thing, then he looked at the creek. His pupils seemed pinned in bright light, though the canopy muted the sun, and his left hand kept 3 fingers pressed to his shirt seam. Reportedly, he asked whether the county still kept the old locker at the maintenance yard, which had once held culvert keys and padlocks. County file from 2009 mentions such a locker by the old bridge yard, though the keys had been replaced several years later. She tried to call it in, but the handheld radio caught only broken carriers, and her phone read emergency calls only with no bars. She moved 3 steps to gain elevation, and the man told her not to climb because the sound would travel in a way the hollow dislikes. She wrote that phrase exactly, and later she told the deputy that the sentence felt memorized, as if learned from another person. Some locals claimed a caretaker used to speak like that when crews closed the creek for culvert work after a flood. Investigators never confirmed the existence of such a caretaker in employment rosters, and state records show seasonal hires with different names. Deputy Redding reached the upper gate at 8:53 and found no vehicle except the county rig and a bicycle with a bent spoke. A laminated trail notice flapped at one staple, and the chain across the spur showed fresh rub where a bumper had kissed it and backed away. He walked the first quarter-mile with his boots scraping wet gravel that held the shape of small hooves and one deep heel print. He radioed his approach and asked any unit nearby to note his time, and the board tagged him green for routine. He did not know about Mara's radio issue until later, and he stated that the hollow always muted signals after rain. Down by the dogleg, Mara stood with the man while the creek stuttered against a culvert that sat half-silted by last week's flow. She asked again what he meant to return, and he said memory travels in objects, and he should not have taken that kind of thing. She did not see any object in his hands, and he avoided looking at her notebook, as if the page itself could unsettle the plan. She asked whether anyone waited for him, and he said someone always waits near water when the season turns toward frost. Records conflict on her next question, but her notes show a line break and a single word reading dresser. The deputy's voice reached them thin and delayed, and the man smiled without showing teeth. Then he lifted his chin toward the upper trail. Mara called back and gave their location with the 2 bends and the flagged snag, and she added the creek noise was rising fast. The man stepped toward the water, and she warned him about the slick bank. Then he told her to listen because a bell would carry. Reportedly, a single metallic strike came from upstream, like a suspended rod hit with a wrench beside running water. The deputy heard nothing from his position, and dispatch logs do not list any equipment operating within that narrow window. Redding found them near the fur pocket, where the creek sounded louder than its width suggested, as if residents lived under the bank. He asked for identification, and the man shook his head. Then he asked whether the locker still existed with its red latch. The deputy answered that county yards kept new lockers now, and old stock had been auctioned or scrapped after an audit 15 years earlier. The man seemed disappointed, and he asked for the year, and Redding answered plain. And Mara wrote that the man looked relieved. Some locals claimed they saw an elderly volunteer in that hollow years ago who checked culverts with a brass key around his neck. The deputy suggested they walk to the trailhead to sort things out, and he offered water and a seat in the rig. The man said he needed to return the borrowed thing first, then he stepped down toward the culvert where water curled and threw pale foam. Redding warned him to stop, and Mara reached for his sleeve, but he raised his hand and said the creek kept the edge steady. He put his fingers into the water and withdrew them clean, then he set his palm flat against the culvert lip as if matching a shape. Investigators later measured a palm-sized shiny patch there, but lab reports described it as scraped algae with no unusual residue. They walked out together, the deputy leading, Mara behind, the man between them with even steps and steady breath that never turned visible. The ridge showed fog rolling from the marsh, and a low engine throb drifted from the highway before fading without any Doppler shift. Redding said the gate would be closed for a while, and he would give the man a ride to town if no one met them at the top. The man asked whether the school still rang a bell to mark fire drills in early autumn, and he smiled when Mara said, "Not anymore." State records mention the bell had been retired 3 superintendents ago, boxed and cataloged. Location currently unknown, according to a brief. At the rig, the deputy opened the passenger door and asked the man to sit, and he complied without hesitation or visible strain. Mara stood at the hood and wrote timestamps while Redding radioed his status and requested a quick check on missing persons. Dispatch searched the usual lists from neighboring counties and found nothing that matched the rough description or the first name variants. The deputy turned back to the cab, and Mara pointed at the seat where the man had sat a moment earlier. Reportedly, the seat was empty, and the door remained closed, and the gravel showed no fresh print moving away from the vehicle. Redding circled the rig twice and checked under the chassis where mud clung to cooling metal, and he lifted the chain at the gate. He called the hollow by name and asked the man to answer if he had stepped away to the trees for any reason. The creak's sound carried up the spur in distinct pulses, like breath held and released by a patient machine somewhere underground. Mara wrote every word she could recall from the conversation, and she added a note about the locker with the red latch. County file from 2009 again surfaced during the report review, where a photograph showed a red latch on a dented locker door. They returned to the dogleg with care, watching their footing and pausing where leaves gathered as though pulled by weak static. The culvert still sang with water, and the foam showed a trailing loop that repeated at a steady interval against a rock. The deputy touched the lip where the man had placed his palm, and he noted the slick patch felt freshly burnished despite running water. He found no shoe prints distinct enough for casting, and Mara's heel marks had blurred where she had steadied herself near the bank. Records conflict about whether a second metallic strike sounded before they left, since only Mara wrote it and the deputy never heard it. Back in town, they filed a minimal incident report and a longer narrative. Then they tried to trace the stitched initials on the shirt. 2 local laundries reported no marks like that in recent months, and the church thrift logs showed a gap where volunteer notes ended. They checked motels along the highway, and one clerk claimed a quiet man had asked about a room that faced north toward Timber. The dates did not align with the morning in question, and the surveillance camera had been unplugged while a breaker was replaced that week. Investigators never confirmed the sighting, and the name written by Mara yielded no match in any database within the state. Weeks later, a maintenance worker clearing brush near the school found an old bell cradle stored under tarps beside broken desks. The bell itself was missing, and a note taped to the cradle listed a catalog number and an instruction about mounting that no one recognized. A second note mentioned the bridge yard locker inventory and a transfer sheet that had been misplaced during a renovation nearly 14 years earlier. Reportedly, the transfer sheet surfaced in a banker's box at the county archive with a signature that resembled a surname read as Laird or Lyle. State records accepted the sheet as authentic, and the archive logged it without any conclusion that linked it to the hollow. Mara visited the ravine again before winter storms and stood at the culvert while crow calls echoed in the timber to the west. She carried the same laminated soils map, and she placed her palm on the lip where the algae had been scraped to a dull shine. The patch had grown back, and the water ran colder than the air, and a faint diesel odor threaded the turns. She wrote a final line in her field book about a borrowed thing as obligation, then she closed the cover and signed beneath. Her handwriting stayed level and small, and the page included the words reportedly and records conflict and county file from 2009. The deputy kept a copy of the narrative in his desk and underlined each place name, then he drove the ridge one last time in late fall. He listened for any metallic note across the creek, and he measured the echo time by counting aloud between 2 flat stones. The count never settled, and he recorded inconsistent results on 3 separate visits, despite clear weather and steady flow through the culvert. He concluded the hollow folded sound in ways he could not rely upon for distance, which meant witnesses would always disagree on what carried. His memo went into a folder marked Acoustics Observations, and the case remained open only as a routine contact with no offense. By winter, the story had traveled the county, and some locals claimed they knew the man from a mill crew that shut down years earlier. Others said he had worked as a night janitor at the school and guarded old things until they were carted off in a box. The claims never aligned on age or family, and the only consistent detail remained the manner of speaking that felt learned. Investigators never confirmed any of it, and state records could not connect a stitched initial to a payroll or volunteer ledger. Larch Hollow returned to rain and runoff and alder leaves, and the creek carried silt that settled where the culvert lip flared. In spring, a set of archived notes turned up in a teacher's cabinet during a custodial inventory that followed a small roof repair after heavy weather. The notes included a list of items removed from a stage closet, among them a bell clapper wrapped in cloth and tagged for storage. The tag showed a year written in a hand that looked older than the paper, and the clapper weight matched the bell recorded by the district. The clerk dated the note to a time just before the transfer sheet at the bridge yard, and the sequence suggested a routine move between buildings. No one could say how a clapper could sound without its bell, and records conflict on whether anyone heard such a strike that year. Mara and the deputy met once more at the trailhead on a clear morning, and they walked to the dogleg without speaking. The hollow smelled of wet iron and fir pitch, and the creek ran thinner across fresh gravel shaped by a late slide. They stopped at the culvert, and a small heron lifted from the bank and drifted under low branches with slow wing beats. They listened long enough to agree that the place felt ordinary in daylight, with nothing to mark it from any other ravine. They left without ceremony, and the report never changed, and the borrowed thing stayed unnamed in both their files.